Welcome to this edition of Thought to Action, the Second Amendment Project edition. I'm Chris Cordani, your host here with Project Sentinel and the London Center for Policy Research. With us from both organizations, the London Center and Project Sentinel, are our president, Tony Shaffer, Lieutenant Colonel retired. We also have Tim Wilson, Lieutenant Colonel retired, British Army. Navy Captain retired Pete O'Brien is with me as well. And we also have the great Tim Furey. He's a fellow for both of us as well, Project Sentinel and the London Center for Policy Research. Catch us, of course, on our websites, projectsentinel.net and londoncenter.org. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more. And check out Tony Shaffer's new radio show, The Hard Truth. We have that on our YouTube channel. You can find us on Rumble and other places, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on the America Out Loud. Tony's show is on the America Out Loud Radio Network. We're Thought to Action wherever you get your podcasts.
And by the way, just a note on my show, it's never flaccid since it's hard. Just saying.
There we go.
just a little tip, so to speak.
We're going to lay down some hard truths about the gun control agenda here, like we do. There's always that pull between public safety and rights. Fact is, though, sometimes the gun control agenda, the people that want to, and they do. We've heard it from some of them. They want to take away your guns, like I don't know, what was that guy?
Beto O'Rourke.
Beto O'Rourke. Robert Francis O'Rourke. That's right. He said we want to take away your guns. You're damn right. Something like that. I think I'm paraphrasing, but we have to fight with these people verbally, and of course through facing their propaganda head on. That's what we're here for, gentlemen. So let's do this. First off, and this is funny because I'm reading stories, and you presented this the other day, Tim, when we were talking. It was last December. The FPC filed a brief in a gun control lawsuit seeking to compel the federal redefinition of firearm. I always say, control the language, control the lexicon, and you can manipulate whoever you'd like. Tim, let's hear what you think about that, because firearm is obvious. Something that you can fire. Wow, that's an arm.
A weapon you can fire.
Right.
Yes, absolutely right.
And it's not letting your arm on fire.
Controlling the language is so important, and the framers were brilliant when they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, in that the phrasing that they used, they considered very carefully for the time, and it was very clear to them at the time, and they left an awful lot of notes and the Federalist Papers and background information written down of all sorts about what they actually meant. And it is fascinating to watch those who believe in gun control wriggle and squirm and amend and obfuscate and just change the definition to suit their version of the truth. The founders wrote the Second Amendment to present the people with the ability not just to own a gun as permitted by the government, but any firearm, any weapon, an arm, the right to keep and bear, i.e. to own and to carry wherever you go, arms, weapons. It was in those days, in the days of the Revolutionary War, most of our warships were actually privateers, i.e. privately owned ships, and they were armed at the expense of the owner. Most people out in the country had weapons, rifles, and even pistols, which they used for hunting and self-defense. And one of the big contingencies that the founders wrote about was to say that the weapons should be available to the citizens of the United States in the event that the government stepped beyond the bounds of reasonability and became overbearing and a tyranny. And if they became a tyranny, it would only be the weapons permitted by the Second Amendment which would allow that tyranny to be overthrown. It's fascinating that all of the tyrannical countries today have strict gun control. Where are most of the problems of the world? Where there is strict gun control. So this changing of the wording, I mean, it does not get, in my mind, much clearer than shall not be infringed. And yet they weasel word around trying to say, oh, it's only a militia. Well, the definition in those days of the militia was anybody over 18, any able-bodied man over 18.
And by the way, I still agree with that definition. Tim has already drafted something that we're working on that we're going to publish soon, right, Tim?
Yep,
Put out.
absolutely.
So we're going to define that better. But to carry on Tim's point, there's a couple things I think we need to address. First, Joe Biden recently was out trying to basically imply that what Tim is saying should be basically forbidden, because according to Joe Biden, you can't have an automatic weapon, you can't have a flamethrower, that the Second Amendment is not absolute. Well, it is absolute. As a matter of fact, I find it ironic that Kid Rock took a machine gun. Apparently, he owns a machine gun. What is a gun that actually fires rapidly with a single pull of the trigger, a machine gun by any definition, and shot up a couple of cases of Bud Light. And I won't talk to why he did that, but he did. It's on the internet. You can go check it out. So clearly, if Kid Rock can have an automatic weapon, other folks can have automatic weapons. And you can have, as long as you have a Class 3 license and submit to certain background checks, you can have a machine gun. And those things are expensive as heck. That's what's most prohibitive is the expense to get one now. But they're around. You just can't import new ones, which has created a huge market for us. So that's a lie. Flamethrower.
I would just note quickly as well, Tony, on that no legally owned machine gun, automatic weapon, has ever been used to commit a crime.
Exactly. Exactly. So fundamentally,
1939.
Right. So fundamentally, Joe Biden is lying. You can't own a weapon, and they're not used in crime. So it's a lie. It's a flat out lie. Any one of us could go down to our garage right now, find something that can create a fuel air mixture and create our own flamethrower. It's not illegal. I mean, it's like, you can. Of course, you can have flamethrowers.
I've got one.
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk, I think, has one. I think he uses it as part of his daily routine to burn the scallops off the spaceships as they come back out of orbit or something, whatever those alien things are, whatever it is. Anyway, and then cannons. To your point, I mean, of course, privateers had all sorts of arms that went beyond small arms. I mean, we're talking about some very big artillery, literally, that went on ships. You can own that now. Nothing prohibits you from having that. So the idea here is that the left creates constantly a narrative that says, oh, this stuff, you can't have it. Well, you can. And then at the same time, they're trying to chase that narrative, those lies with actual legislation to make the lies become real. That's what's going on.
Yeah, and let me just jump in there. I agree with everything that Tim Wilson says at kind of the broader picture of things. To get kind of to the minutia of what they're talking about here is under federal law, the definition of what a firearm is the receiver. And this was set up many decades ago, and both the side from the regulator side, the ATF, as well as the gun community, have kind of pretty much been fairly comfortable with this definition. Because let's say if you have an AR-15, right, and you break it down into its two primary parts, do you now have two firearms? And that creates all kinds of difficulties on all kinds of levels. So what everybody pretty much agreed to is that this receiver, which is an instrumental part in basically every firearm out there, is what the gun is. And it effectively isn't even the physical piece too, because if this receiver gets damaged, you could, let's say, then replace it, put the same serial number on it, even with machine guns, and it's the same firearm, right? So what Joe Biden wants to do is saying, well, even something that could be a receiver is potentially a firearm. Now, the issue there is now you have 3D printing capabilities where they can now take a block of aluminum and then machine that into a receiver. So they want to say, are they going to eventually say that block of aluminum is a firearm? And what are the extensions of this? And as crazy as this seems, the ATF and the FBI, when they want to, they have made really broad stroke use of a lot of these laws to really put people that didn't do anything wrong in prison. For one instance that you'll see a lot of these about is people that have, let's say, semi-automatic firearms who suffer malfunction, where all of a sudden the gun goes full auto, right? You have a defect in the firearm. Well, you can be arrested and face 20 years in prison for illegal possession of a firearm, possession of a machine gun. And this happens. So that's what we're talking about, and that's what Joe Biden effectively wants to do.
Pete, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think I first of all, I agree with what my compadres here are saying. But But I think really the most important part is what was already said is this effort to control the language, the effort to essentially be able to define on their side what you're doing as wrong is a fascinating and fantastically bad, but fantastic approach to anything, because what it allows them to do is not worry about the niceties. When all is said and done, they'll change the wording, and thereby you're guilty because they changed the wording. And one of the things that needs to be looked at here is people need to understand that control of firearms isn't about control of firearms. Control of firearms is about control of you. This is about establishing the government as the primary power and the origin of whatever rights you may or may not like to have. They'll tell you. It's a function of removing the power from the people. We the people. The opening line of the Constitution is of fascinating importance because what it says is the government is not in charge. The government, that bureaucracy, that big monster that eats trillions of dollars of our tax revenue every year, that thing is a servant. It works for us. When you start to give the government the ability to change the meaning of the words, you're giving the government the ability to redefine who works for whom. And that's the thing that we need to be looking out for in the near term. And of course, go back to what was also said earlier. The reason why the Second Amendment is there is to provide the people the ultimate guarantor that the government can't do that thing. As George Washington said, the Second Amendment is the people's liberty's teeth.
If I may just loop that right back around, it's worth remembering that the founding fathers wrote the Second Amendment in part because they trusted the people much more than they trusted the government, even though they were the government. They knew that trusting the government with too much power was a really bad idea. And that was a large part of why they included the Second Amendment. They knew that the majority of American people are good, trustworthy, and capable of handling firearms. And that is still very much true today. I mean, we have somewhere between 4 and 6, maybe even 8,000 defensive gun uses per day. We have maybe 40 to less than 100 for sure firearm incidents around the country each day. Compare that. We are talking thousands versus less than 100. So are firearms that bad in the hands of qualified, useful, good citizens? No, they are not dangerous. They're actually protective. And when the police can't be there, which they can't, I live more than 20 minutes away from the nearest policeman. If somebody breaks into my house, I need an answer now to protect me and mine.
Yeah, it does take the police some time to get there. I want to go back to something that Pete said. The gun control isn't generally about controlling guns. It's about controlling you. Case in point, the brace registration requirement. It's about that time. I believe by the beginning or end of May, your arm braces for pistols have to be registered, or else you can serve some time, or you would be paying a big fine, whatever they want to do. The idea is they want to count who has what and make sure they register who has what. They already do that with the guns, but now they're doing it with the accessories. This could snowball into something else too, but the idea is now it's a non-firearm that's being registered.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I've spoken to my braces. They don't feel that they want to be registered. So I'm, who am I to say that they have to be registered? I mean, I'm going to be nice to them. So I'm not going to force anything I have. And again, everybody presumes that these guns do things on their own. And I'm making light of it, but it's kind of like, are you serious? These are literally pieces of inanimate objects that do nothing. They do nothing except allow a shooter, a person who is being trained or trained to use the weapon, to shoot it more safely. That's it. That's all it does. There's no enhancement of a bullet's capability to damage or maim. by its use or not use. It's completely ambivalent. There's nothing for greater or lesser regarding a brace. It's nothing. It is literally a piece of plastic in most cases, or plastic and metal in most cases. In some cases, it's like a little band. It does nothing to enhance or detract from a bullet's performance. Zero, zip, nada. And yet, this is the level of insanity we're now seeing perpetrated on the American people by this bureaucracy. And again, it's not going to make anybody any safer ever. Not a single person will ever be affected in any way, shape, or form regarding their safety by anything this issue does one way or another. I mean, by limiting it, it means nothing.
It is like so many other bits and pieces, like pistol grips and flash eliminators.
Right.
They are actually safety devices that make it safer to shoot the gun.
Exactly.
The more accurate you are, the safer you are using that gun.
Exactly.
And yet all these things are taking away from that and therefore making it less safe, in the same way that taking away and preventing law-abiding citizens from having the means to defend themselves, especially minorities, poor people, disabled people, the very elderly, who cannot just fend off, a late teen, early 20s drug addict bursting through the door, trying to rob and kill them and who knows what. And the only thing that can keep them safe.
And if I can throw in the category of people that I think ought to have damn near universal firearm possession is women over the age of 18. There was just an incident in New York, was it yesterday or the day before? A young woman stabbed to death by a fellow in a hotel. Stabbed to death by a man who had been he was out on, he was released after, I don't know, a dozen or 2 dozen charges, different incidents where he'd been charged and he kept being released. This guy's out, and this young woman is brutally murdered. And again, I go back to there should be no woman walking around who doesn't have a pistol in her handbag. It just is ridiculous to me, and it incenses me that they don't. And yet, instead, the answer is we have jurisdictions in this country where the district attorney is letting these people out on the street, and now this young woman is dead. And it's just ridiculous. And the old line that God made man, Sam Colt made them equal. That resonates in a situation like that. That young woman should have had a pistol.
Over the last 30 years, we've seen more than 25 states now go from some form of restriction to constitutional carry. The murder rate has continued to drop throughout that time. The gun control people were forecasting blood on the streets and yet wherever it happened, murder rates have dropped.
Right.
I would posit quite simply that those that maintain gun control works are not only wrong, they are murderously wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just ask the average scumbag, what would you do if you knew that every other woman on the street in front of you is armed?
Yeah, and let me just put on, before we move on, just to add on to some of what Tim Wilson said, because I think he's very much right. The argument that the Biden administration was making was that these braces are supposedly enhancing, that they could be shouldered and therefore make it a short-barreled rifle, which is already defined and regulated under existing laws. You have to have these registered. Well, if you are looking at something that actually creates greater stability, right, if that's your argument, then why are you necessarily against that?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
You're promoting some kind of spray and pray type targeting system here. I mean,
exactly.
We've seen, especially in urban areas, that leads to collateral damage of innocent people being killed, kids getting ready for school and bullets coming through the walls and stuff. I mean, it's just ludicrous. And the other aspect of this is, again, I thought that the Biden administration, especially coming out of the whole Black Lives Matter movement, that a big part of this, and this is actually going well before George Floyd, a discussion of a de-incarceration of society, right? And so we're screaming and yelling about, look, like people who actually go out and violently hurt people or rape women or things like that, or the case that Pete just mentioned. And yet the Biden administration is resisting that kind of prosecutorial action, and yet instead is going after and trying to put people in jail for felony convictions where they lose their voting rights because of nonviolent criminality of just possessing something.
Right.
Something here really doesn't make sense. Somebody wasn't paying attention when we were talking about not building more prisons in this country.
Oh,
On that, let me back that point up on a couple things here in North Carolina. So first off, the only people who opposed we don't quite have constitutional carry, but we're one step closer. That's the next debate here in North Carolina. Recently, I don't know if you guys knew this, if to buy a gun in North Carolina, you had to get a sheriff's approval. And you had to go through a background check, both locally with the sheriff, and he checked mental records and everything else. I had to go through this to get my concealed carry permit. And then you had to go through the federal check as well, And so it was a double whammy. Basically, the Republicans said, it's enough. This is enough. The sheriffs don't need that power. Thank you very much. That's a Jim Crow remainder, or what do you want to call it? It's a Jim Crow element. Basically, it was created about the same time Jim Crow was, to make sure that sheriffs had the final vote on if you got a gun or not. And that was not anything else than a control that did not need to be there. Anyway, so the state finally said it's time to leave it. So, of course, the veto comes from the governor. The governor says, Democrat says, oh, no, we don't want to let go of Jim Crow. It's not time yet. And the Senate overrode it instantly. They had a veto-proof majority, and then the legislature did not. They were short one vote, and yet a Democrat crossed over. And as a matter of fact, that Democrat became a Republican as of today. That person changed over. So now there's a veto-proof majority in both houses of North Carolina, of the Senate and legislature. My point being is that this should be the direction the country's going, to remove literally those elements of Jim Crow which still do exist. Because, and again, the irony here, the big people who are most vigorously defending the right of sheriffs to veto people having guns was the Democrats. It's like, how do you not see this as being completely stupid? The idea here is if you pass a national background check, you're good to go by all standards that are established, then you get the gun. That's it. There should be nothing that you have to jump through regarding hoops or anything else. So I think the trend in North Carolina at least is going in the right way. And again, the next thing I think on the agenda is constitutional carry, which obviously I think that'll be pushed through as well, because right now the legislature can override the governor. And I think that's a good thing at this point.
Yeah, Tony, just a little cap on that. I think that's a good point. One of the things that we should all, talking to your elected representatives, or things that I've even put forward to the leadership of many of the gun control groups personally, is you ask them very simple questions. Do you support the repeal of laws that disenfranchise low-income folks and people of color? Do you support the repeal of those laws? And shockingly, many of these folks won't do it. I published an article a couple years back in National Review called Gun Control's Black Lives Matter problem, that addressed these issues, that you still have most of the majority white gun control groups that blatantly still support Jim Crow legislation. And somehow these hate groups are nuzzled within the progressive left. And I don't really understand how this hasn't been called out yet, but I hope our listeners, whenever they get a chance, go to your elected officials. It's really fun to watch.
Yeah, and I've talked about this in our interviews and discussions here before. I had a college friend. I was at a Nationals game in DC, and she said, my black friends are talking about arming up. And it's like, yeah, well, aren't you worried about that? It's like, no, why would I be worried about that? Well, these people don't generally have guns. Like, yeah, I think that's part of the problem, that they've been discouraged from having weapons. So no, I don't know what you're saying, other than it sounds kind of racist, but I'm all for law-abiding citizens being armed no matter what their skin color is. And that's still pervasive on the left.
If I can state this in simple terms for those of our listeners who don't understand, because they just haven't been familiar with it, is the laws that sprang up in this country in the 1920s and 1930s, and which have subsequently been amended and changed and added to limit gun ownership. The laws that were drafted to limit gun ownership sprang from one concern only by the same group, the Democratic Party, and that was to keep guns out of the hands of minorities.
Yep.
That's what those laws came from. Nothing else.
And on the back of that, the Brewing case in New York it was not just the repeal of some carry law, it was a repeal of a direct Jim Crow law that dates back to the year 1911. And the shocking thing about this, and this hasn't been called up enough, is that there was something very historical about this, because we like to in this country call out firsts when it comes to demographics. I believe this was the first time a black woman went to the Supreme Court to defend keeping a Jim Crow law on the books. And I think that's a whole other subject, but I think that's something that's very concerning, at least to me personally, of how the civil rights movement has certainly veered off course, or is not necessarily being followed by the people that were the original benefactors of it.
Well, you might say it's been co-opted by the insiders in the Democratic Party, is that they've twisted it and turned it on their head for the purpose
That's
of power.
absolutely true. I think there are a lot of folks within certain communities that are willing to sell out the core values that actually enabled them to reach those offices, and they did so to ingratiate themselves with, let's be honest, rather wealthy white Democrats, so they can get ahead with their careers. And I think that's very sad, and I think that's something that needs to be called out, because that really hurts everybody.
And that includes the DA in New York who brought that case.
May I just do a short rant about gun control in general? There are over 400 million firearms in this country legally owned. There are probably another 45 million illegal firearms in this country, and they include all sorts, because funnily enough, the criminals don't obey any of the laws anyway. Murder is already against the law. Using a gun makes no difference, as it were, in terms of the end result. But gun control is based on this premise of, oh, if only we can get rid of the guns. There are so many guns already in circulation in this country, that is a pipe dream. And the only way to do it will result in a huge number, many millions of good, law-abiding American citizens suddenly being made felons, criminals, by the legislatures passing laws that criminalize gun ownership.
Perhaps that's the idea, though. Keep in mind, as Pete said earlier today, it's about control of you, not necessarily about gun control. If it was about keeping people safe and anything like that, we wouldn't have these no gun zones in cities. We wouldn't have bloodbaths in these cities where they're keeping or doing their best to keep honest citizens away from weapons. Whereas the criminals, as you've all said many times, will always have the weapons. Now, here's something funny. Oregon, never to be outdone. Oregon state legislature is trying to pull another fast one. They figure, hey, you know what? The other states like California and New York just aren't liberal enough for us, aren't leftist, Marxist enough for us. Why don't we go a step further and not allow, or let's have a firearms age, so not allow young people from anybody under 21 years old to own a firearm. That sounds ridiculous. First off, when you're 18, you can be trained to use a firearm at in the military. Secondly, when you're 14, you can have a small game license in many states. This is crazy. But again, this sounds like this is going to sound a lot like the drinking age thing, where some insurance companies or some big money donors are going to influence a few states to raise the gun ownership age as they did the drinking age, and then the federal government's going to have somebody, maybe Biden to the 10th power or more coherent, stumble their way into the presidency again, and try to threaten other states with the loss of aid if they don't copy what Oregon and perhaps some other states would do afterwards and raise the gun ownership age to 21.
So I'm completely offended that this generation can't experience a kegger with a fraternity while you use shotguns to shoot, pumpkins on the ranges. I'm completely offended you can't do that now at 18. I mean, it's just not the same world not being able to do that. But being as facetious as I am about it, it's like, no, I mean, I started shooting at 14. I was given a .22 rifle. in upstate New York, in a little place called Cuba, New York, on a farm, and go shoot, go figure it out. And here I am all these years later, and I'm still in one piece. I didn't shoot anything that day that shouldn't have been shot. I was careful. I learned the basic skills then, and the idea that someone who can go serve their country at 18, literally put their life on the line, can't own a weapon for personal protection is beyond insane. It's Stalinist is the best way to put it, I suppose.
If I may, I'll just take that as another step further. Not only that, Tony, these youngsters can sign up at 18, for some reason retired, injured by the time they're 20. They're not allowed to keep to own a weapon.
Right.
What, after they've left the military? Gosh, that's horrible.
I think this is crazy. I subscribe to a general rule that, all right, we want common sense restrictions on guns. What are those common restrictions? So here's a good rule of thumb. Person that can't own a gun, can't vote, can't hold political office, and vice versa, right? So if we're saying that you can't actually own a firearm until you're 21, the voting age should be increased to 21, and you should not be able to run for office and all the other things. Because as soon as you start putting it that way, it's all of a sudden, wait a minute, never mind. I mean, you got to keep in mind too that when you look at voting in New York City, for instance, they've talked about lowering the voting age to 16.
Right.
Now, so this is craziness, and I mean, you could, and vice versa. Let's say if you're like a voting rights activist, you could say, well, wait a minute. If they're saying that they're increasing the ability to own a firearm to 21, that could potentially be used as an argument for increasing the voting age as well, right? So this just seems ludicrous for me. And a party that is, supposedly so close to young folk, I'm surprised that not more within, I'm a little bit beyond that age now, but a lot of these young people aren't saying, wait a minute, are you saying that I'm somehow a criminal or violent or something because I haven't hit 21 yet? I mean, that just seems crazy to me.
If you're watching these parades and watching social media, you'll find a lot of these very young people would probably support something like that because many have been taught to be afraid of guns or afraid of such weapons.
Chris, they are easily persuaded to change their minds because one just turns around and uses Tim's argument to say, well, in that case, you can't drive till you're 21 either. It's dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, and with driving, although they may be able to do that because driving being a privilege versus a right, which I think is a lot of things that is a very subtle.
Same with voting, by the way. Voting is the same thing. Privilege, not a right.
Well, voting is. Well, I would disagree on that.
It's a privilege, not a right.
We won't take our son on that one.
It's a privilege of U.S. citizenship, and that's where when they left will argue that illegals can come in and vote. Right, there we go.
Yeah, semantics. But yeah, I mean, so I think that's look. The problem is the whole gun control debate, especially when taken to like young people in colleges, is I don't think put really in the same way. It's things are looked at from the standpoint of, let's say old white men and we're going to defend the country and all this stuff like that. And the issues like some that we discuss at the London Center and Project Sentinel are not really discussed, of the issues of racial equality, discrimination against young people, immigrants, things of that nature are not part of the dialogue. But once you start speaking from that respect, right? Once you start saying, well, no, I disagree that people of color are inherently violent and we shouldn't support laws that say that they are, the entire mood changes. So I'm frequently in places where it's very progressive or NYU, Columbia, things like that. And I never have a problem discussing gun rights and gun control because I just come at it from a different angle.
Well, I can look back on what worked for my generation, and I'm older, obviously, and my first gun, I purchased my first pistol, which is a Taurus 90 model. It's the Taurus. It's the copy of the Beretta, and I think it's model 92 AF. It's still in my safe. I got it downstairs. I got it when I was literally 19 years old in Ohio, and I legally purchased and used operationally a number of times. And so, look, why not? Why would anyone want to prohibit someone who's legally competent, as much as like you can be, I guess, in my case, but otherwise has adequate training and understanding of the law to use it safely? Why would you want to restrict that? And it comes back to Pete's point. And to Tim's point, it's all about control. This has nothing to do with safety. This has nothing to do with anything except trying to insinuate controls on individuals who don't have the same political view as others do. As a matter of fact, maybe that should be the restriction. If you're a Democrat, you can't have a gun. How about that? If you're registered as a D, no gun for you.
Well, and there is a kind of a horrible flip side to what you just said, Tony. Is that you could make the argument that the reason why some of these essentially dark blue cities, these very democratic cities, have been democratically controlled for years. The reason why they continue to let them degrade is to allow them to make a case that they need to use excessive control in those cities and to strip the few remaining rights that we do have in those cities, to strip them from us so that they can somehow, 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, regain control over these cities. And in the meantime, the daily shootings in places like Chicago, well, that's just a cost of doing business. There's this sort of horrible, willful neglect of the people of places like Chicago and Baltimore, San Francisco. That's just a cost of doing business. That's a cost of gaining power.
And can I just add something? To Tony, I know he said it somewhat in jest of his last comment on banning Democrats. I think that's actually an interesting point, because of all my time, and I think that a lot of pro-gun people spend a lot of time with other pro-gun people. I spend a lot of time with a lot of the gun control activists too, and there are some who actually do want to legitimately ban all firearms, right? That's one. But the majority of it, when you look at it from the Democratic side, they don't want to ban it. They want to control who has them. Right?
Exactly.
If you look at, I'm originally from New York City, it was people who were white, wealthy, and well-connected. The 3 W's. That's really what it took to get a permit to have in your home. And so if you were connected to any of the administrations or the police departments or the fire department, after 9/11, firemen were getting permits a lot quicker, right? You had this discretionary thing that just went with the wind and who you know, right? And if you look even at politicians in California and some of these famous cases where one of the DA, her husband went to the was this in LA County or something? I forget the details of it. Met an activist at the door with a handgun. Well, wait a minute, this is a city that's trying to ban guns, but yet they legally have it. So it's all about them having it and not other people who are rightfully, like the regular folks.
Yeah, I was at a debate. Ken Cuccinelli was my state senator in Virginia, back when before he became the Attorney General for Virginia, and he was debating Janet Olezek, a flaming liberal if there ever was one. And I actually attended the debate, and I went up to Olezek after the debate. I said, because she was spouting off about gun control and common sense gun control, and people should be limited in who has them. And I walked up to her and I said, look, this is long before I was a public figure. I was still, just another guy on the street. And I said, look, with all due respect, I'm a combat veteran. I've carried a weapon most of my life. I've been this close as I am to you, to John McCain with a loaded firearm on my side in combat. So what's the difference between Tony Shaffer having a gun in combat, being this close, and now? She says, well, you're different. It's different for you. It will be okay for you to have a gun. What? So it's all about distinguishing who they believe could adequately or politically have a weapon. It has nothing to do with the recognition that every citizen has an individual right to defend themselves. And I think that's what's always lost by the left. And they don't care. They don't care if you have the right to defend yourself.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Pete.
Well, I was going to say, just to add in, and it has nothing to do with the mayhem that's being unleashed in certain inner cities around the country. Those poor folks just, they don't count.
No.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? The common sense laws that they keep claiming to want to impose don't have any common sense behind them. It's another classic political lie. If you can't actually make a point in favor of it, just label it as common sense and hope it passes. There is no common sense in trying to ban guns in this country. That's my whole point about 400 million weapons already out there. You can't magically make them disappear with a piece of paper just because some self-important people have written their names on it and called it a law. It's not common sense.
This is from the same people who can't define what a woman is. Just remember that too.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, I'm not saying that Michelle Obama should worry, but I'm just, you know,
that's gotta hurt.
I don't know.
You do mention gun control. We've talked about how Britain kind of manipulated its way. It took a whole century to do so. Canada's trying to really shove it down everybody's throat. The CR-21. They got backlash from trappers and hunters because the law, as it stood, would generally eventually make them criminals because the idea was to freeze the sale of guns, to freeze the sale of firearms in the future. People just don't think outside of, and again, I would say there's a very urban bubble bias when it comes to the U.S. and Canada, and I guess a lot of Western Europe, whereas some of these people are living in their close quarters, go to the same cocktail parties or whatever they want to do, and they don't really venture outside of their said bubbles, their neighborhoods, their cities, or maybe they travel to similar bubbles like New York to San Francisco, New York to LA, that sort of thing, New York to Seattle, and all around there. They don't understand what's going on around them. So Canada, which is tone deaf to anything outside of Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Quebec City, and I'll even say Quebec City, they pretty much ignore a lot of stuff there. They don't realize that there are people who hunt, trap, and provide food, that sort of thing, and they live out in areas like that.
Go further than that. They live in a place where wildlife is actually dangerous to human beings.
That's right.
And,
we do too.
You know, and the Inuit, for example, hunt. What are they supposed to hunt with if guns are taken away from them? And this is a law, as you rightly say, wanting to be imposed by big city elites and classically the likes of Justin Trudeau, who, guess what, has armed security with him all the time.
Absolutely. And they don't even understand. They don't even venture out to understand how other people live.
They don't want to. They don't want to.
Same here.
They do not care.
Exactly. They don't care. Hey, they'll be like, hey, I was on the subway for 20 seconds. There's no crime on the subway street. Yeah, well, you're right in the middle of Manhattan, somewhere safe with your armed bodyguards. Of course, there's going to be no crime around you. However, travel off to the tough sections of the Bronx and Brooklyn. You're going to see some problems there. They don't want to do that. Well, they won't, because they'll turn around and pretend it doesn't exist. Just like Jerry Nadler did when somebody showed them the burning cities.
Tell that to the 3 people this year who've been pushed off subway platforms in front of trains in upper east and west side this year.
Oh, it happened in Times Square too.
Then the liberals are going to start banning hands if you keep talking about that. So
no, I mean, look, where I live here in North Carolina, I can literally go open carry. I could strap on a gun, go to the store. I see people do it all the time. But here I feel the least need to do that. To the point you guys just made, I'd rather be armed in New York where there is an actual threat I have to worry about. Yeah, is there a threat down here? Probably. Do I keep a gun close by? I do. I don't necessarily have to have it on me, but I don't feel that pervasive. Something bad may happen. And because the chances of it happening here are minuscule, literally, I don't know what the odds would be of something bad regarding a gunfire exchange here versus New York City. It's astronomically different. So,
I want to thank all of you for joining us for this edition of the Second Amendment Project from Project Sentinel and the London Center for Policy Research. We have more of these coming. We do have the Culture Wars, as well as Red Alert China and the Great Reset Roundtable. We have a lot of those coming up in the future. We do have some past ones. Check them out on our YouTube channel, Rumble channel, and anywhere where you get your podcast. I want to thank all of our participants, Tony, Tim, Pete, and you out there. You have a comment about what we said, you want to check us out in the future, comment, join the conversation, dislike us. We just would like to hear from you and want to know what you think about this issue. And of course, the many others we cover here with Project Sentinel and the London Center for Policy Research. For the fine gentlemen and ladies that are part of our organizations, I want to say thank you for joining us and stay informed.